Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to address you today. I was asked to speak about federal funding for water infrastructure projects, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Preparing for the talk allowed me to reflect on what a historic year 2021 was for water infrastructure funding. The endless grind of the pandemic makes it easy to forget the silver linings. And in this case, the silver lining is that Congress recognized how important water is for public health and provided unprecedented amounts of funding for water infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin by taking you back to March 11th, 2021, and the signing of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. This legislation, signed in the first few months of the Biden administration, provided $1.9 trillion to help recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Included in this bill was the creation of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. This $350 billion fund, administered by the Department of Treasury for state, local, and tribal governments, is historic. Never before, and perhaps never again, will the federal government provide such a large sum of money to local governments to stimulate the economy. Next slide, please. The formula for distribution of the funds was set up so that the largest states received the most funding. For once, California came out on top. We received more funding than any other state in the nation. The state of California received $27 billion, and I'm pretty sure our next speaker is going to discuss this one in more detail. Counties in California, approximately $7.7 billion. Metropolitan cities, another $7 billion, and other units of local government, another $1.2 billion. While the state has already received all of its funding, counties and other units of local government have only received half of their funding. They will receive the final round of funding this spring. The Fiscal Recovery Fund is designed to both help with recovery from the pandemic and stimulate the economy. These funds can be used for four purposes, one of which is to make necessary investments in water and sewer infrastructure. The inclusion of water infrastructure was a reflection of how important these resources are in the pandemic. No other types of infrastructure projects except broadband were eligible to use these funds. And let me tell you, lots of other sectors tried to angle in and obtain this funding. Next slide, please. For water and sewer projects, Treasury interpreted the phrase necessary investments to mean projects that would be eligible for EPA's Drinking Water or Clean Water State Revolving Fund, plus a host of other activities, including lead service line replacement, climate change adaptation, dam and reservoir rehabilitation if the primary purpose of a dam or reservoir is for drinking water supply. And all of these funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and construction must be completed by December 31st, 2026. Next slide, please. As you all know, Congress continued to fund infrastructure projects in 2021. After months of negotiation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, was signed into law on November 15th. This bill, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, funds all traditional types of infrastructure projects, including, again, water projects. The bill is often reported in the news as a $1.2 trillion bill, but that represents both authorizations and appropriations. Authorizations are just permission slips to go seek funding in future appropriations bill. Appropriations are real federal dollars. The IIJA includes $550 billion in direct appropriations over the next 5 years. Like ARPA, this is a historic investment that dwarfs previous infrastructure bills. Next slide, please. You may have heard reports that there is $55 billion in IIJA funding for water, but in my opinion, that's an undercount as it primarily represents funding to the Environmental Protection Agency. I take a more expansive view of federal water funding and include the Army Corps projects, Bureau of Reclamation projects, and EPA programs in my definition of federal water programs. IIJA provides $17 billion to the Army Corps of Engineers. Among other things, the Corps funds navigation and flood control projects. As a water person, I would be remiss not to mention the Corps, as the agency plays a critical role in several projects in Southern California, including restoration of the LA River. I'm not going to take a deep dive into the Corps funding because it's very prescriptive. Your project is either already on the list and authorized to receive funding, or it is not, and you are trying to get your project authorized by Congress as part of the next authorization bill known as WRDA 2022. One item I did want to highlight for you, though, is that the IIJA funded for the first time a new Army Corps low-interest loan program, similar to EPA's WIFIA program. This funding mechanism will start out focused entirely on dam repair projects. If you are in need of funding for dam repair projects, this new funding mechanism is something you should tune into. The Bureau of Reclamation helps finance water infrastructure projects in the 17 Western states. IIJA provides this agency with direct appropriations of $8.3 billion over 5 years, or $1.66 billion per year. This is nearly double its yearly budget, and this additional funding will be primarily awarded as grants. I will take a deeper dive into this funding shortly. Last, but certainly not least, the IIJA provides approximately $50 billion in funding to EPA's water programs. About $48 billion of this is going out directly to the states through the SRF program over the next 5 years. For once, the state's SRF programs will be flush with cash, and I will discuss this in more detail in the coming slides too. Change slides, please. This slide gives you a more in-depth view of Reclamation's IIJA funding over the next 5 years. As you can see, the bill provides large amounts of money for various reclamation programs. The additional funding touches on every aspect of Reclamation's mission, including storage projects, water recycling projects, and ecosystem restoration work. Many of these programs are important to Metropolitan. We were actively involved in helping to secure additional funding for the water recycling projects and creating the new large-scale water recycling program. We greatly appreciate the work of our congressional delegation to help make this happen. Next slide, please. January 14th marked 60 days since enactment of the IIJA. And as directed by law, Reclamation released its plan for how the agency will invest its additional $1.66 billion in 2022. The IIJA provided program-specific total 5-year appropriations for Reclamation, but gave Reclamation the freedom to decide specific per-year allocations as long as total spending over 5 years meets the specified amount. For example, if you recall from the last slide, Reclamation received $550 million over 5 years for the Title 16 water recycling program. You can see from the 2022 spend plan that Reclamation has decided to front-load its spending on this program and plans to invest $245 million this year. This is a historic investment as the program only receives $60 million per year through the normal appropriations process. Another highlight of the spend plan is that Reclamation is using IIJA funds to fulfill its obligations to the recently signed 500-plus agreement with the lower basin states to create and conserve additional water in Lake Mead. At this time, there is no funding allocated for the new large-scale water recycling program. In fact, there is no funding allocated to any new reclamation program created in the IIJA. However, Reclamation left $280 million in reserves for 2022, and we are working with Reclamation to allow some of this funding to be used for the large-scale recycled water program. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, EPA funding for water programs is primarily provided through the State Revolving Fund. The Drinking Water and Clean Water SRF received direct appropriations above and beyond their usual yearly appropriations. Additionally, 2 new funds were created. The Lead Service Line Replacement Fund will be distributed using the Drinking Water SRF, and the Emerging Contaminant Funds will be distributed through both the Drinking Water SRF and the Clean Water SRF. 49% of the Drinking Water SRF, Clean Water SRF, and Lead Service Line Replacements funds must be awarded as grants or full principal forgiveness loans. All of the emerging contaminant money must be awarded as grants or principal forgiveness loans. Next slide, please. In December, EPA released preliminary allotment of funds to the states. Once again, California comes out on top. The state is set to receive $609.4 million for the SRF program this year, more money than any other state. This is in addition to the yearly SRF appropriations the state receives, and also the lowest amount of IIJA SRF funding that will be flowing to the state over the next 5 years. The IIJA phased-in increases to the drinking water and clean water SRF, starting with $1.9 billion nationally for each fund and escalating to $2.6 billion for each fund in 2025 and 2026. EPA is currently developing implementation documents to guide states in the administration of these funds. Once the documents are completed, the SRF funds will be released to the states. It is anticipated the state will receive its SRF funding in what they sometimes call late winter and other times early spring. Whatever you want to call it, it's coming to the state pretty soon. Next slide, please. As if all of this was not enough, there are still more vehicles out there to provide additional federal funding for water infrastructure. There is, of course, the traditional appropriations route. Federal fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th, and we are well into the FY 2022 year. The federal government is currently running on what is known as a continuing resolution, keeping government funded at FY 21 levels until February 18th. If a deal can be reached, there's more funding on the table for existing federal programs. The President, House, and Senate have all proposed increasing water infrastructure funding in FY 2022. The Build Back Better Act is in the news a lot lately, too. The House-passed bill includes additional funding for water programs at EPA and the Bureau of Reclamation. The Build Back Better Act also includes tax parity for water conservation measures. Rebates offered by water agencies for turf removal, low-flow toilets, etc. are considered tax